Welcome to my channel. My name is Antonio Gervasoni. I'm a Peruvian composer and university professor, and this is the third video in my series on orchestration, which aims to introduce you to some key aspects of this wonderful art. In this video, I'll briefly explain the concept of reinforcement in orchestration. One of the most common functions that an instrument or group of instruments can assume in an orchestration is to provide reinforcement to a certain element of the music. In fact, duplicating, say, a melodic line to add color to it, as I discussed in my previous video, inevitably reinforces it, although the effect can be very subtle if planned carefully. Reinforcement can be done for different reasons. For example, a certain element may be underrepresented because it's taken up by fewer instruments, or because the instruments or instruments involved are not capable of matching the loudness of the rest. In such a case, the element in question must be strengthened so that the balance of the whole is assured. Another typical case of reinforcement occurs when the orchestrator decides to add short entries from other instruments to accentuate some beats in a certain passage. Finally, reinforcement may also be necessary when an orchestrator wants to highlight a certain element of the music that is not the main element but will be lost if it's not given a little more weight. Doubling is the term used in music to describe the duplication of a certain element by different instruments of the orchestra. In this context, a complete section of the strings, like the first violins for example, is considered as a single part, which in soft dynamics can be more or less equivalent to any solo instrument of the winds. Modern styles of music can bypass this procedure and produce results in which no part is ever doubled by another. However, in this video series, I'm dealing only with the more common approach of writing a limited set of simultaneous melodies, traditionally known as voices, that will be then doubled by various parts of the orchestra. Doubling doesn't necessarily have to happen in unison. A voice can also be doubled in another octave. This works due to the physics of acoustic phenomena, which I'll not explain here. Suffice it to say that octaves reinforce each other. Because of this, some orchestral pieces, especially older ones, can be reduced to such a small set of voices that a single pianist can play them all, a process known as reduction. In more complex cases, two pianists will be needed. In fact, orchestrators are also asked to produce reductions of symphonic works for study or rehearsal. As an example, take a look at this passage from Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony. If we ignore all the doublings, we're left with this, which can indeed be played by a pianist. The strings consist of 5 sections, 2 for violins, 1 for violas, 1 for cellos, and 1 for double basses. If a piece has 4 voices, that is, 4 different and independent melodies one on top of the other, it's very common to double the lowest between the cellos and the basses. However, this doesn't mean that the orchestrator will give the upper voices to the other 3 sections. He may decide, for example, that it's better to give the top voice to all the violins together, in which case the violas will have to be divided in order to take the 2 inner voices. This procedure will strengthen the upper voice, which may be what the orchestrator wants, but it will also weaken the inner ones. In some cases, this will not sound bad, but in others, a reinforcement of the inner voices may be advisable. In those cases, a pair of clarinets or bassoons, perhaps with lower dynamics, can do the trick. The opposite, that is, reinforcing the woodwinds with the strings, is less common. The problem here is that the strings will inevitably sound different, not so much because of their timbre, but because they are played in sections and not as individual instruments, giving them a different sound quality. Nevertheless, reinforcing the woodwinds with pizzicati or doubling a contrabassoon with a double bass, for example, will surely work. Brass instruments can be used in the same way as woodwinds to reinforce parts of the strings. The example is similar to the one we've just seen, but here the violas take the second voice and the cellos the third. Since double basses sound an octave lower than written, there is a gap between them and the cellos. On the other hand, for physiological reasons, we have trouble hearing very low frequencies. For this reason, it's necessary to double the lowest voice one octave higher to ensure that it's heard clearly. The idea in this case is that the timbre of the strings predominates, and that of the brass remains in the background. Therefore, the best option, almost the only one in any case, is to use the horns, since their timbre is close to that of bassoons and, consequently, also that of cellos. However, it could also be possible to use the tuba to reinforce the double basses. Reinforcing the brass with the strings presents the same problem given for the woodwinds. Nevertheless, a very common case is the use of double basses to reinforce the tuba. Due to their low register, the double basses are hardly heard. There's one last detail to take into account: dynamics. Brass instruments sound much louder than strings when they are all playing loud. Because of this, the brass need a lower dynamic if they are to reinforce the strings, and the opposite is needed if it's the strings that reinforce the brass. The use of woodwind instruments as reinforcement of the brass is usually done with the bassoons in their low register, reinforcing the third trombone and the tuba. In loud passages, the bassoons will remain in the background, but since in this case there are only two brass instruments taking the lowest voice, the bass, the bassoons are capable of adding some punch. It would also be possible to think of a passage in which several woodwinds in unison reinforce one of the voices in the brass, but it would have to be at least 3 or 4 woodwinds for the procedure to be really effective. In softer dynamics, woodwind instruments would have no problem reinforcing the brass, and we could also think of a chord progression in the latter in which the woodwinds reinforce the attack with short notes. Using the brass to reinforce the woodwinds is almost exclusively limited to the use of horns to double voices that have not been sufficiently represented in the latter, and even more so when there's a gap between the bassoons and the rest of the instruments that needs to be filled. The use of trumpets and trombones is rare because they don't blend as well with woodwinds as horns do, and the two groups are somewhat separate. Also, in this case, dynamics is an important factor to take into account, as we have seen. In my previous video I mentioned the balance problem posed by the combination of strings, woodwinds, and brass. The latter have a dynamic curve that grows much more than the rest of the orchestra when they reach forte. This presents a problem regarding reinforcement, as there is little that strings and woodwinds can do to reinforce the brass in a loud tutti. However, Ravel presents an alternative in his orchestration of Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition. In this passage of the last movement, the strings are written in the same register as the brass, except for a part of the first violins. This means that the strings will be mostly covered by the brass, but the multiple stops, which should be played as a sort of strum, can be clearly heard before each chord. Another possibility is to simply give the brass a lower dynamic and/or not use all of them. Lastly, register is also essential. If the brass are confined to the lower parts of their register, where they have less force and sound darker, high woodwinds and strings placed on top of them may be more audible. Reinforcement is probably one of the things percussion can do best. Indeed, percussion instruments can sound not only louder than all other groups combined, but their attack is also faster, allowing the orchestra to produce a very accurate hit. There are countless examples of this in symphonic works, from the beating of the timpani at crucial moments in a piece to a heavy hit produced by the combination of several percussion instruments, as in this example by Rimsky-Korsakov. Listen to this chord by all groups except the percussion. And now listen to the same chord with added percussion instruments. In general, the great notoriety of percussion instruments will make them stand out, so their role in the orchestration will probably always involve some degree of reinforcement. However, some instruments, such as the marimba and even the timpani, can participate in ways that add color rather than reinforce anything. Reinforcement is used to strengthen an underrepresented element in the orchestration, to accentuate specific beats, or to add more weight to an important element. Bassoons and clarinets are sometimes used to reinforce the internal voices of a string passage. The reverse is less common and is more effective with individual instruments than with an entire section. The horns can be used in the same way. On the other hand, reinforcing the strings with brass presents the same problem as the previous one, but a common case is the use of double basses to reinforce the tuba. In any case, dynamics must be controlled due to the high sound power of the brass. Bassoons are commonly used to reinforce the low brass. In strong dynamics, 3 or 4 woodwinds may have to play in unison to be of real use. The use of brass to reinforce woodwinds is almost exclusively limited to the horns, because the other instruments do not combine well. In a loud tutti, the brass can receive lower dynamics or be limited to their lowest register, where their sound power decreases. Percussion instruments tend to stand out, so their role will probably always involve some degree of reinforcement. Thank you for watching this video, and subscribe to be notified when I post a new one. I give private lessons online on orchestration. If you want to know more, click on the linked video or visit my website. The link is in the description below.